Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know, you can't really explain, but you feel it. In fact, you've felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know exactly what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. And that, of course, is more or less from the first Matrix movie. And I'm quoting it because I think it's a good way of describing how a lot of us feel about the world, especially these days. That there's something not quite right about it. Something strange and unsettling woven into the fabric of everyday life. Something weird and maybe even a little insane. But of course, as with everything else that's human, not everyone feels that way. Some of us wake up in our beds every morning and simply plod through another day, believing whatever we want to believe, never once sensing how strange things are. But over time, I've found that most people I encounter actually can relate to what Morpheus is saying in The Matrix, even if it's not particularly polite or appropriate to talk about it. And so in this video, I'd like to explore why the world is so weird, or at least why it seems that way a lot of the time. But before launching into all of that, I'd like to give credit where credit is due. The topic of this video was inspired by a comment left by a viewer who goes by the name Sean Burnham. Sean Burnham. So, little tip of the invisible chapeau to you, Sean Burnham, wherever in this world you might be. Okay, so I'd like to begin by suggesting that part of the world's weirdness has to do with how we've defined normality in the first place, which I'd say is mainly in terms of instrumental rationality. In other words, what's normal is what's rational, and what's rational is what accords with reality, especially in a way that helps us get what we want. And ultimately what we want, or at least what we say we want, is to be happy. It's the same basic vision of life that emerged during the Enlightenment, the idea that adopting a rationally coherent relation to life will eventuate in greater happiness for the human race, most obviously in the form of the ever-evolving triumvirate of science, industry, and technology. And I think it's undeniable that over the last 500 years or so, that promise has come to fruition in many important ways. But on the other hand, that same vision of rational happiness has frequently proven to be incredibly myopic, especially with regard to recognizing how the rational decisions we make in the microcosm of everyday life can easily produce very irrational effects in the macrocosm of life's bigger picture. But at this point, maybe the best way of illustrating that would be to look at a few examples. Let's say you've been creeping along in a traffic jam for a couple of hours. And as you're sitting there, you're probably wondering what the hell the problem is, and probably feeling a little irritated by it too. And eventually, you spy the answer. It's just a broken down car with its hood up, parked off to the side of the road. And there's a big traffic jam because everyone is slowing down to gawk at it. And then, because the whole annoying ordeal has already consumed about 2 hours of your life, you're sure as hell going to take your sweet time to stare at it too. After all, you've paid your price for admission, so to speak, and so you're definitely going to see the show, even if there's really nothing to see. And that sort of logic is perfectly understandable, especially since it's basically the logic of rational self-interest. But the problem is that it's also what generates those sorts of traffic jams in the first place. Basically, everyone is behaving rationally from the perspective of their own self-interest, which in turn is producing an irrational and undesirable result that leaves everyone fuming, both literally and figuratively, on the highway for, 2 hours? Okay, another example. A lot of addictive behavior works the same basic way. Addiction is a powerful force in human affairs, partly because there's almost always an immediately convincing rationale for taking the next hit, the next drink, the next fix, whatever. After all, just one more won't really hurt us, right? And anyhow, we deserve it, don't we? Or maybe we tell ourselves we just need it to make it through the day. But of course, that's exactly the kind of logic that eventually generates addictive problems in the first place, and can even end up destroying your whole life. Doesn't seem too logical from that wider perspective. Oh, well, damn, I was just trying to have a little fun, but instead I ended up stumbling into an early grave. Oops. Or take the case of nuclear armaments. Has it ever struck you as odd that humanity's rational struggle to increase its overall happiness has also ended up wiring the entire planet for instantaneous nuclear obliteration? 13,700 nuclear bombs and missiles on planet Earth last time I checked. Well, pretty impressive accomplishment. Well, I think you know how all of that happened. Every small step along the way seemed rationally justifiable at the time. After all, if we don't produce the next batch of bombs, our enemies certainly will. And we definitely need to protect our sovereignty, our values, and our way of life, don't we? Well, yeah, of course. But the problem is that we now live in a world where the thermonuclear eschaton is always right around the corner. It's convenient that way, I guess. And perhaps it'll be followed by a radioactive zombie apocalypse, maybe in the vein of Fallout 4. So strap on your Pip-Boy, kids, and make sure to look out for feral ghouls and super mutant overlords on your way to Diamond City. Or consider the logic of overpopulation. Isn't it always something like, well, there may already be 8 times 10 to the 9th human beings on planet Earth, but there'll still be room for my kids? Yeah, it's the same basic logic that runs through traffic jams, addictions, nuclear arms proliferation. Hell, if it gets any worse, we're going to have to start using Avogadro's number to keep track of everyone. Newsflash, 2.4 moles of human beings on planet Earth. Have a nice day. And by the way, our world is full of plenty of other examples in politics, in the economy, in the way we mistreat the natural environment. Just turn on the nightly news and I bet you'll notice a lot of others. But the underappreciated irony is that it's all really just the same old story, just in different guises. But my main point, what's my point? My point is that part of the weirdness of the world is being produced by the fact that our prevailing vision of rationality is itself somewhat narrow and myopic, by virtue of the fact that it usually fixates on what's small and immediate and hardly ever takes the big picture into account, which in turn fills our world with lots of contradictory and self-defeating dynamics that make it, well, just plain weird. In other words, our world is weird partly because we're not thinking holistically. Not yet, at any rate. And so our narrow view of rationality presents us with only a truncated and distorted picture of life's larger reality. For instance, we hardly ever think about how the decisions we're making today might affect our world 7 generations from now, as Iroquois legend would have it. And if you're still not convinced of the ubiquity of all of that, well, just spend a few minutes listening to the rhetoric of our so-called leaders, who hardly ever seem to be able to focus their attention on anything beyond the next election cycle. And so we just keep grinding along, creating a world that keeps getting weirder and weirder with each passing minute. A world ever more thoroughly governed by the underlying irrationality running through our rational decisions. Okay, so at this point, let's look at a second reason why our world is weird. And it has to do with what I call its dimensionality. And here I'd say that a very large fraction of life as we know it plays out across a 2-dimensional space that's defined, naturally enough, by 2 axes. One of those axes runs between productivity and consumption, and the other between entertainment and boredom. In other words, a lot of our lives has to do with moving between being a producer who's working a job and being a consumer who's spending money. And at the same time, a lot of it has to do with trying to feel like we're entertained and happy rather than bored and unhappy. And so basically, a lot of our lives is about moving among the four quadrants of that two-dimensional space, oscillating between production and consumption on one hand, and between entertainment and boredom on the other. And for people who are thoroughly inured to it, living in that flattened out world probably doesn't seem too weird. But to some of us, it does. Mostly because it seems really obvious that there's also a depth axis to our lives, and probably higher order dimensions too. For instance, an example. Consider our spiritual or religious experiences, those incredible moments when we feel the breath of divinity moving through us, coursing through our bloodstream and filling us with life. Think about what those experiences really mean. Or try to remember a time when you suddenly realize that you're actually a luminous being, shining like a beacon in the endless night of this world, as one moment of your life gives way to the next, and then the next. And okay, maybe it's been a while since you felt that way, and if that's true, there's absolutely no shame in it. But try to remember what it feels like. What it feels like to be alive, to be beautifully and poetically and undeniably alive, to consummate your very existence for a moment or two fully and completely, and to see everything as it actually is, infinite, including your own soul. And if you're pretty sure that you've never felt that way in your entire life, well, there's no shame in that either. After all, the world doesn't exactly make it easy, does it? But on the other hand, just because you've never felt that way doesn't mean that you're incapable of it. In fact, you can feel that way right now, because when you think about it, well, hell, why wait? Especially since if we're honest about it, which we rarely are, this moment right now might be your very last chance. And anyhow, what's really stopping you other than the deadening weight of habit and social conformity? Just a thought. Anyhow, I think that what's really happening when we have experiences like those is that we're starting to see beyond the two-dimensional paradigm we've all been taught. Basically, at that point, we've taken the red pill and are starting to perceive things along the hidden and often forbidden depth axis. But as strange as all of that may sound, it's not really what makes our world weird. What makes our world weird is the discrepancy between the two-dimensional template for our lives that the world is constantly offering us and the n-dimensional nature of our souls. And that's the point of discontinuity that makes the world weird. Basically, the world is weird because we've all been taught to speak prosaically in an inherently poetic and miraculous universe. But once again, that doesn't mean that it always has to be that way for any of us. And when you think about it, hell, why should it? Boom. Okay, so at this point, I'd like to mention a third reason why the world is weird. And it has to do with how easy it is to feel like no one really sees or understands or gets us, which in turn can easily translate into a pervasive sense of homelessness, of not belonging or fitting in. Basically, the feeling of alienation. And to an extent, all of that is perfectly justifiable. As I mention fairly often in my videos, that's because genuine understanding is actually a pretty rare thing in this world. Of course, we all like to think that we're pretty good at understanding other people, but in reality, we're not. That's because what we're usually doing is judging other people, judging the people around us, and then mistaking our judgments for actual understanding, which makes us feel like we understand people when in reality, we're not even close. But the point is that part of what makes the world weird is that we hardly ever see or get each other, which in turn results in a fairly pervasive sense of homelessness and alienation in our world. And because many of us are thoroughly mired in the habit of judging each other without much actual understanding, our world is now plagued with all sorts of divisions, fault lines, and festering animosities across pretty much every dimension you can think of. Gender, race, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, political affiliation, hell, you name it. Basically, we live in a world of separation rather than connection, of petty bickering and resentment rather than the joy of connection and common enterprise. And perhaps most of all, we live in a world where it seems like everyone has some sort of ideological axe to grind, where people are constantly insisting that we have to join their crusade, worship their gods, and parrot their talking points. And woe betide anyone who doesn't take it seriously. And yeah, I'd say that that's another thing that makes our world weird. I don't know about you, but personally, I don't believe in trying to badger and shame other people into behaving like our pet trained monkeys, just because we've convinced ourselves that we know what's best for them, usually without even bothering to ask them. Instead, I believe in a world of free thinkers and free spirits, people who are willing to range over the wide expanse of life's possibilities, in their minds, in their hearts, and in their souls. I believe in those rare and radiant spirits who have enough courage to navigate the seas of this world according to the stars of their deepest possible destiny, and who are willing to reach out across all of the artificial divides that separate us to help other people do the same. That's what I believe in. But hey, that's just me. And if you think differently, well, you don't have to worship my gods any more than I have to worship yours. I think there's room in the universe for that. So there they are. 3 reasons why I think the world is so weird these days. And I'm sure that it's far from a comprehensive list, but hell, at least it's a start. So let's summarize them. Reason 1. The world is weird because we've adopted a narrow and myopic idea of what rationality is. And as a consequence, our decisions very often seem sensible and convincing in the moment, but end up generating a lot of strange, irrational effects at the level of life's bigger picture. Reason 2. The world is weird because we've been taught to believe in a 2-dimensional picture of life which doesn't reflect the actual depth of our souls. And finally, reason 3, drum roll please. The world is weird because we hardly ever understand each other or try to reach out across the chasms that separate us. And as a consequence, we've generated a world filled with a whole lot of divisive ideological proselytizing and hucksterism. And yeah, as a consequence, I'd say that we live in a pretty weird world these days. And it seems to be getting weirder and weirder with each passing year. But on the other hand, I don't think that the situation is necessarily hopeless. In my mind, the weirdness besetting our world these days is ultimately nothing more than a challenge. Another one of life's opportunities to better ourselves and to improve the state of our world in the process. And who knows? Maybe if we can manage to take advantage of that opportunity, our world might eventually start to feel a lot less weird and a lot more like home. Just a thought. Anyhow, as always, thanks for listening. I appreciate your time and I appreciate your attention. And of course, as always, take care of your soul.